Cruel billionaire family rejected their black ex-daughter-in-law. Now she owns everything they once had. Comment below from which city you are watching and hit the like button for more videos. It began in a glittering mansion where chandeliers sparkled and laughter echoed like polished glass. A place where money was louder than love and cruelty often hid behind champagne smiles. The billionaire Harrington family was known for their empire, but more than that, they were known for their arrogance. And in their perfect world, one person never seemed to fit in. Her name was Amara. She had once been their daughter-in-law, the quiet, graceful woman their son had married despite the whispers, despite the looks. Amara didn't come from wealth. She didn't have a famous last name. She was a black woman who had walked into their ivory tower of power with nothing but her dignity, her kindness, and her love for their son. But to the Harringtons, that was never enough. At dinner parties, they looked through her like she was invisible. At family gatherings, they mocked her background, questioned her worth, and whispered insults she could hear loud and clear. And when her marriage to their son finally crumbled under the weight of betrayal, they celebrated. They thought they had rid themselves of her once and for all. The night Amara walked out of their mansion, clutching nothing but a suitcase and her pride, the family's matriarch whispered words she would never forget. "You'll never belong here. You'll never have what we have." They believed she would fade away, that she would struggle, that she would always remain beneath them. But they had no idea what kind of fire they had just lit inside her, because humiliation can break some people. But for others, it becomes fuel. And for Amara, every insult, every cold glance, every cruel word became the spark that ignited her transformation. She worked in silence. She sacrificed in private. She poured every ounce of pain into building something of her own. Step by step, brick by brick, she created an empire that no one could take from her. An empire larger, stronger, and more respected than the Harringtons had ever dreamed of. And while they were busy mocking her, while they were too blind with pride to notice the ground shifting beneath their feet, she was rising higher than any of them imagined. Years later, the same family that had laughed in her face would open their doors to a woman they thought they had destroyed, only to realize she was the one holding the keys to everything they once owned. Their empire, their power, their legacy. All of it. And the quiet, humiliated ex-daughter-in-law they had thrown away was now the woman who owned their world. This is not just a story of revenge. It's a story of strength, of dignity, of resilience. Because sometimes the people you cast out, the people you underestimate, are the very ones destined to rise higher than you could ever imagine. And for the Harrington family, that painful truth was about to come crashing down. Before the world knew her name, before her story became one of whispered legends and headlines, Amara lived a quiet life defined not by wealth but by resilience. She wasn't born into luxury. She wasn't raised in the circles of power. Her roots were simple. A small, close-knit neighborhood where doors stayed open, children played barefoot in the streets, and neighbors looked after one another. Her mother worked long hours as a seamstress. Her father spent his days fixing engines in a dusty workshop. They didn't have much, but what they had, they cherished: community, integrity, and a relentless belief that tomorrow could be brighter than today. Amara carried those lessons with her everywhere she went. In school, she was the girl who stayed after class to help others. In college, she studied tirelessly, her nights spent balancing textbooks with part-time jobs just to pay tuition. She had dreams bigger than the walls that contained her, but she never lost the kindness that made people gravitate toward her, and it was in one of those ordinary moments, a university fundraiser surrounded by laughter and noise, that she met him. Daniel Harrington. Daniel was everything Amara wasn't: heir to one of the wealthiest families in the city, born with the Harrington name that opened doors she would never even be invited to knock on. He was charming, magnetic, and drawn to her, in a way no one expected. She wasn't dazzled by his money or his name. She saw something human beneath the tailored suits and practiced smiles. And for Daniel, that was intoxicating. Their love story bloomed quietly, like a secret garden no one else could enter. Walks across campus, study sessions that turned into whispered confessions, nights when Daniel escaped the glass cage of his Family's mansion just to sit with Amara under the stars, where titles and money meant nothing. But love, as powerful as it was, rarely comes without a shadow. The first shadow came when Daniel introduced her to his family. The Harringtons were everything people imagined, polished, cold, and impossibly proud. Their wealth was not just money. It was armor. It was arrogance. To them, Amara wasn't a young woman with ambition and heart. She was a stain on their perfect image, a reminder that their son had stepped outside the bounds of acceptable. At dinner, their questions cut sharper than knives. Where did you say your family comes from? Are you sure law school won't be too much? You understand, don't you, that Daniel has responsibilities? Amara smiled politely, her voice soft but steady, while Daniel defended her again and again. But behind those polite smiles and champagne glasses, she could feel the disdain, the whispered judgment, as though she had trespassed into a world she didn't deserve. For a time, love shielded her from it. Daniel's devotion gave her strength. They married despite the icy stares, despite the gossip that traveled like wildfire through high society. In the photographs, they looked radiant, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. Amara tried to win them over. She attended charity galas. She smiled through cocktail parties. She wore the dresses their designers picked out for her. But no matter what she did, she was always the outsider, and it wasn't just whispered words. It was in the way the matriarch, Eleanor Harrington, looked at her with eyes colder than marble. It was in the way the family patriarch barely acknowledged her existence. It was in the way Daniel's siblings smirked when she mispronounced the name of some elite wine, as though her every breath was a reminder of how she didn't belong. Still, Amara endured. For Daniel, for love. But as the months turned to years, cracks began to form. Daniel, once so defiant, began to waver. The weight of family expectations pressed down on him, pulling him back into the Harrington orbit. Arguments began, quiet at first, then louder. His promises to stand by her faltered, replaced by late nights, excuses, and silences that said more than words ever could. And through it all, the Harringtons watched, waiting for the moment she would break. What they didn't realize was that every insult, every cold glance, every humiliation at those glittering dinner tables was carving something deeper inside Amara. Not weakness, not despair, but resolve. Because even as she smiled through clenched teeth, even as she played the role of the quiet outsider, Amara was already imagining a different future. One not defined by the Harringtons. One where she wouldn't just survive their cruelty. She would rise above it. But for now, she remained. In their mansion, at their table, playing the part of the unwanted daughter-in-law, and no one, not even Amara herself, could have predicted just how far that resolve would take her. Or how the very family that mocked her would one day bow, their heads in her presence. The stage was set. The storm had not yet broken, but every quiet humiliation, every cruel whisper, every cold dismissal was a spark. And soon, those sparks would ignite a fire the Harringtons would never forget. The Harrington estate was a palace of glass and gold, but for Amara it became a cage. Every hallway whispered with judgment. Every dinner table turned into a battlefield of polite cruelty. She was no longer simply an outsider. She was a target. It began subtly. A misplaced invitation here, a forgotten announcement there. When the Harrington Foundation hosted a charity gala, Amara's name was mysteriously missing from the guest list. When the society pages featured the family at luncheons or fundraisers, she was cropped out of the photographs. A printing error, they'd say with thin smiles. So unfortunate. But these weren't accidents. They were rehearsed humiliations, carefully staged to remind her she didn't belong. Still, Amara endured. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself that Daniel's love would outweigh their cruelty. But as months bled into years, that hope began to fray. The breaking point came during the Harringtons' annual Winter Gala, their most glamorous event, where politicians, CEOs, and media moguls gathered under glittering chandeliers. Amara had chosen her dress carefully, a gown that shimmered with understated elegance. She had convinced herself This night will be different. Tonight, I'll prove I belong. But when she entered the ballroom at Daniel's side, the whispers began. Who invited her? Look at her trying too hard. She'll never be one of us. And then Eleanor Harrington, the matriarch herself, delivered the final blow. With a smile so sharp it could cut glass, she raised her champagne flute and declared to the crowd, "To family traditions and keeping our legacy pure." The laughter that followed wasn't just cruel, it was suffocating. Amara felt her throat tighten, her chest burn. She excused herself, slipping away to the empty balcony, the city lights below blurring through tears. When Daniel found her, he didn't wrap her in comfort. He didn't defend her. He sighed, his voice heavy with resignation. Maybe they're right, Amara. Maybe this just isn't working. Her world cracked. The man who once swore to fight for her had surrendered. And in that moment, surrounded by the echoes of laughter from the ballroom, she realized she was alone. The divorce was swift, brutal, and humiliating. The Harrington lawyers descended like vultures, stripping her of dignity with every document she was forced to sign. They made sure she left with nothing, no claim to their fortune, no access to their estates, no place in their history. Eleanor herself oversaw it, her cold smile never faltering as she whispered, "You were a mistake. Now disappear." And so Amara did. She returned to her small apartment, far from the glittering world she once touched. Nights were spent staring at the ceiling, days spent numbing herself with work that barely paid the bills. She felt broken, discarded, like a chapter torn from a book. But grief has a strange way of hardening into something sharper. One evening, as she sat surrounded by unpaid bills and unanswered job applications, she remembered her mother's words. "They can take everything from you, except your mind." That night, Amara opened her laptop. She poured herself into learning, finance, real estate, investment strategies. She devoured every book, every lecture, every scrap of knowledge she could find. When she couldn't afford courses, she found free ones. When doors shut in her face, she found windows. Her pain became fuel, and slowly, opportunity answered. She started small, flipping a modest property in a forgotten neighborhood. While others dismissed the area, she saw potential. She renovated it with care, turned it into something beautiful and sold it for double. That first profit was small by Harrington standards, but to her, it was a spark. One spark led to another. She reinvested, expanded, learned faster than her competitors. Where the wealthy saw ruins, she saw foundations. Where they saw risk, she saw opportunity. In just a few years, Amara built her own empire. A real estate firm that grew from one forgotten building to entire blocks of revitalized neighborhoods. Investors began to notice. Her name began appearing in the same magazines that once ignored her. Not as a Harrington outsider, but as a visionary in her own right. But the true twist of fate came when she discovered who owned the debt on some of the properties she was eyeing. The Harringtons. Their empire, though glittering on the outside, was rotting from within. Years of arrogance had blinded them to new markets, new opportunities. Their assets were bleeding value. Their debt was mounting, and without realizing it, they had left their legacy vulnerable. Amara saw the opening. She began buying. Quietly, strategically, piece by piece, she acquired what they thought was untouchable. Their failing ventures, their neglected estates, their forgotten stocks. Until one morning, Eleanor Harrington walked into her boardroom to find Amara sitting at the head of the table. The papers were already signed. The Harrington fortune was no longer theirs, it was hers, but this wasn't just revenge. It was reclamation. When news of the takeover spread, the same society pages that once mocked her now splashed her face across their covers. Amara Johnson, the outsider who rose higher than the Harringtons. Yet Amara wasn't interested in gloating. She redirected her fortune into building scholarships, funding small businesses, revitalizing communities like the one she came from. She became not just a success story, but a symbol, proof that resilience could outshine privilege, that strength could outlast cruelty. And when the Harringtons, stripped of their empire, tried to approach her for help, she gave them the same cold smile Eleanor once gave her. "I don't hold grudges," she said, "but I don't forget." The very family that once laughed at her now depended on her mercy. And in that moment, Amara realized something profound. True victory isn't about revenge. It's about rewriting the story so no one else has to suffer the way she did. The woman they rejected was gone. In her place stood the one who owned everything they had lost, and more. And this time, no one could erase her name. The silence in the Harrington boardroom was deafening. For decades, this room had been their throne, the place where billion-dollar deals were signed and dynasties were preserved. Now, that silence was suffused with something unfamiliar. Defeat. Ataï. The head of the table sat Amara, calm, composed, radiant in her quiet authority. Across from her, the Harringtons fidgeted, Daniel shifting uncomfortably, his once confident shoulders now slumped. Eleanor, her diamond necklace glinting like a last desperate shield, and the others, their faces pale with the realization that the power they clung to had slipped away. Amara let the silence stretch, savoring it not as revenge but as validation. Years ago, they had told her she was nothing. Now, they needed her signature to survive. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. This isn't personal, it's business, and unlike you, I build to last. She signed the final document with a graceful stroke, and just like that, the Harrington Empire belonged to the woman they had once thrown out like trash. But victory was not about humiliating them. Amara understood something far greater. Power, without purpose, was emptiness. She had been given a chance to rewrite the script, not only for herself, but for countless others who had been silenced, overlooked, or discarded the way she once was. And she would not waste it. Within months of the takeover, Amara restructured the Harrington properties. The cold glass towers that once symbolized exclusion were transformed into centers of opportunity. Luxury estates were repurposed into community hubs, scholarships were funded through the profits, and small businesses were given loans at fair terms. Newspapers called it unprecedented. The New York Times ran a headline, "From Outcast to Architect, Amara Johnson redefines legacy." Investors lined up, eager to back not just her projects, but her vision. Her empire grew, but this time, its roots were not in greed. They were in resilience. Meanwhile, the Harringtons faced the consequences of their arrogance. Their lavish lifestyle shrank overnight. The cars, the estates, the sprawling vacation homes, gone. Eleanor, once the queen of social circles, found invitations no longer arrived. Daniel, who had once looked down at Amara, was forced to face whispers of his own failure. The very society that had laughed at Amara now whispered behind the Harringtons' backs. And in their fall, Amara saw the ultimate irony. The empire they built on exclusion had crumbled because they underestimated the very woman they cast out. Still, when Daniel approached her one late afternoon, his eyes heavy with regret, Amara listened. I was wrong, he confessed. About them, about you, about everything. She studied him for a long moment. The man she had once loved, but who had lacked the courage to stand beside her. A part of her wanted to lash out, to make him feel the depth of her pain. But she had outgrown the need for revenge. You weren't just wrong about me, she said softly. You were wrong about yourself. Then she walked away, leaving him with nothing but the weight of his choices. For Amara, life became more than reclaiming what she lost. It became about building something. Enduring, she launched the Johnson Foundation for Equity and Opportunity, creating programs for underprivileged youth to access education, mentorship, and capital. She visited schools, stood in community centers, and looked young dreamers in the eye, telling them the truth no one had told her. You are enough. You belong. And don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Those words spread. Her story became a beacon for countless people trapped in cycles of doubt and discrimination. She wasn't just a business mogul now. She was a movement. Years later, on the anniversary of her takeover, Amara returned to the Harrington estate, no longer as an outsider, but as its rightful owner. The grand halls were the same, the chandeliers still sparkling, the portraits still hanging. Yet everything felt different. She walked slowly through the corridors where she had once felt small. The whispers that once haunted her were gone. In their place, Her footsteps echoed with authority. On the balcony where she had once wept alone, she now stood tall, overlooking the city she had conquered. But this time, there were no tears. Only pride, she whispered to herself, as if speaking to the younger version of her who once doubted. They can try to erase you. They can try to break you. But if you endure, one day, you'll write the ending. The impact of Amara's legacy rippled far beyond wealth. Years later, when history books recounted the rise and fall of dynasties, the Harrington name was a footnote. But Amara's name was etched in chapters of transformation. The woman who was once cropped out of photographs now had her portrait hanging in halls of honor, celebrated for her vision and resilience. Her empire thrived not because of inherited privilege, but because it was built on empathy, courage, and foresight. And that kind of foundation could never be shaken. For the Harringtons, time was less kind. Eleanor lived long enough to see her family reduced to irrelevance. She spent her final years watching Amara's name rise higher, while hers faded into obscurity. It was a punishment far greater than Amara could have ever planned. As for Daniel, he lived with regret. He watched from the sidelines as the woman he once doubted became a legend. And every time he saw her face in the news, every time he heard her name spoken with respect, he was reminded of the night he chose cowardice over love. But Amara? She chose a different path. Not bitterness, not vengeance, but something stronger. Purpose. Her story became a lesson, told not just in business schools but in classrooms and households. A reminder that power can come from the most unexpected places, that cruelty may wound, but it cannot define, that sometimes the very act of being cast aside can plant the seed of something extraordinary, because true legacy isn't about what you inherit. It's about what you create, and Amara had created something eternal. The family that humiliated her thought they were protecting their empire. Instead, they handed Amara the fire she needed to build something greater. Her story reminds us, what others use to break, you can become the very fuel that makes you unstoppable. In the end, the Harringtons lost everything. Amara didn't just gain it back, she turned it into more than they could ever imagine. Not just wealth, not just power, but impact, and that is the kind of victory no one can take away.